Hello and welcome to English with Ryan. Let me tell you something that might shock you. You are not bad at English, not slow, not untalented, not a language person. And yet, you still can't speak. You've spent years learning. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10, maybe even longer. You've memorized vocabulary lists, studied grammar rules, watched videos, downloaded apps, taken classes. You understand a lot. You can read, you can listen, but when it's time to speak, nothing comes out. Your mind freezes, your heart races, words disappear, and you start telling yourself the same story again. Maybe I'm just not good at English. That story is wrong, and today, we're going to break it. Because the truth is simple and uncomfortable. You didn't fail English. English failed you. The system you trusted, the schools, the courses, the methods taught you how to learn about English, but never how to use it. Think about it. Did anyone ever teach you how to actually speak? Or did they teach you how to fill in blanks, choose the correct answer, memorize irregular verbs, and pass exams? You were trained to recognize English, not to produce it. That's why you can understand a sentence when you see it, but can't create one when you need it. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's a lack of training in the right skill. Imagine trying to learn how to swim by reading books. You could study techniques, watch videos, but the moment you enter the water, you panic. Because swimming is not knowledge. It's a physical skill. And so is speaking English. Here's the brutal truth. You don't need more vocabulary. You don't need more grammar. You don't need another app. What you need is a completely different approach. Because right now, you are stuck in a loop. You consume content. You feel like you're improving. But when it's time to speak, you reset to zero. Again, and again, and again. Meanwhile, you see other people. People who started later than you. People who know fewer words. People who are not smarter. Speaking fluently, confidently, freely. And you wonder, what do they have that I don't? The answer? They're not better than you. They just didn't follow the same broken system. This is not about talent. It's about method. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. In this series, I'm going to show you exactly why you still can't speak English. Not the obvious reasons. The real ones. The uncomfortable ones. The ones nobody told you. And more importantly, I'm going to show you how to fix it. Not in theory, but in reality, because you are not stuck. You are not behind. You are not incapable. You were just trained the wrong way. And once we change that, everything changes. Chapter 2. The biggest lie. More vocabulary will make you fluent. Let's talk about the advice you've probably heard 1,000 times. Learn more vocabulary. Sounds logical, right? The more words you know, the better you speak. So you did exactly that. You downloaded flashcard apps. You memorized word lists. You learned synonyms, phrasal verbs, idioms. Maybe you even challenged yourself. 10 new words a day, 50 a week, 1,000 a year. And now, you know a lot of words, but you still can't speak. So what happened? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Vocabulary is not your problem. Because knowing a word is not the same as being able to use it. Let me show you something. If I say the word opportunity, you understand it instantly. No problem. But if I ask you right now, use opportunity in a sentence naturally, smoothly, without thinking too long. What happens? You pause. You hesitate. You start building the sentence in your head, translating, checking grammar, second-guessing, and suddenly, a simple word becomes difficult. That gap, that delay, that struggle, that's the real problem. It's called the gap between recognition and production. Recognition is passive. You see or hear a word, and your brain says, I know that. Production is active. You have to pull the word out, build a sentence, and say it instantly. Most learners spend 90% of their time on recognition. very little on production. That's why your brain is full, but your mouth is empty. You've trained yourself to understand English, not to speak it. Think about how you study. You read words. You review meanings. You maybe write them down. But how often do you actually say them out loud in real sentences? How often do you use them in conversation? How often do you practice retrieving them under pressure? Probably not much. And that's why your vocabulary doesn't show up when you need it. Because your brain doesn't store words the way you think. It doesn't store them as isolated units, like a dictionary. It stores them as patterns connected to situations, emotions, and usage. If you never use a word in a real context, your brain treats it as low priority. So when you try to speak, it doesn't come. Not because you don't know it, but because you've never trained it for use. Here's a simple example. You might know the word hungry, but you don't think, I'm experiencing hunger. You say, I'm hungry. Why? Because you've heard it, used it, and repeated it in context. It's automatic. That's what fluency actually is. Not knowing more words, but having the right words ready at the right time. So, let's be clear. More vocabulary will not fix your speaking problem. In fact, it can make it worse. Because the more words you try to remember, the more overwhelmed your brain becomes. You start overthinking. You try to choose the perfect word. And while you're searching, the conversation moves on. Fluent speakers don't use more words. They use fewer words, better. They rely on patterns, phrases, and repetition. They don't build sentences word by word. They use chunks they've practiced before. That's why they sound natural. And that's why you feel stuck. So, if vocabulary isn't the solution, what is? In the next chapter, we're going deeper into another trap you've been stuck in for years. One that feels smart, but is secretly holding you back every time you open your mouth. Grammar. Chapter 3. The Grammar Trap. Why thinking too much is killing your speech. By now, you've seen the pattern. You learned vocabulary. It didn't fix your speaking. So, naturally, you turn to the next solution everyone recommends. Grammar. Because that sounds like the real foundation, right? If I understand grammar, I can build sentences. So you studied tenses. Past simple, present perfect, future continuous. You learned rules, structures, exceptions. You practiced exercises. You corrected mistakes. And slowly, something changed. You became more accurate, but not more fluent. In fact, when it comes to speaking, you might have gotten worse. Why? Because grammar didn't just teach you structure. It taught you to hesitate. Now, every time you try to speak, something happens in your head. A voice appears. Is this the right tense? Should I use have or had? Is this sentence correct? And while that voice is talking, you're not. You stop. You check. You adjust. You restart. And the moment is gone. This is the grammar trap. You've been trained to think before you speak, but real communication doesn't work like that. Let me ask you something. When you speak your native language, do you think about grammar? Do you analyze sentence structure? Do you consciously choose verb tenses? Of course not. You just speak, because your brain has already internalized the patterns. Grammar exists in your speech, but not in your awareness. That's the key difference. Fluent speakers don't ignore grammar. They just don't think about it while speaking. But you were taught the opposite. You were taught that speaking correctly is more important than speaking naturally. So now, you try to be perfect. And perfection is slow. Perfection is heavy. Perfection kills flow. Here's something most learners don't realize. Grammar is a tool for editing, not for creating. Writers use grammar to refine what they've already produced. But speakers? Speakers need speed. They need flow. They need momentum. If you try to apply grammar rules in real time, you overload your brain. Because speaking is already a complex process. You're thinking of ideas, choosing words, managing pronunciation, reacting to the other person. And now you add grammar analysis on top of that? It's too much. So, your brain freezes, or slows down so much that you lose confidence. And here's the worst part. The more grammar you know, the more you overthink. You become hyper-aware of mistakes. You start correcting yourself mid-sentence. You stop halfway just to fix something. And every interruption breaks your rhythm. This is why some people with less grammar knowledge speak more fluently than you. They don't have that voice in their head. They just go. They make mistakes, but they keep moving. And communication continues. Because in real life, people don't need perfect sentences. They need clear ideas. They need connection. They need flow. So let's be honest. Grammar didn't fail you, but the way you use it is holding you back. You've been using it at the wrong time. Learning grammar is not the problem. Depending on it while speaking is. So, what should you do? Do you ignore grammar completely? No. But you change its role. You use grammar after speaking, not during. You let yourself speak freely first. Then you refine later. That's how fluency develops. Because fluency is not about correctness. It's about continuity. And right now, something else is quietly destroying that continuity even more than grammar. It's not what you know. It's what you don't do. In the next chapter, we'll uncover the hidden imbalance in your learning. The reason you consume so much English, but still can't use it when it matters. Chapter 4. Input versus output. Why you're always learning but never speaking. At this point, you've done everything right. You learned vocabulary. You studied grammar. You understand more English than ever before. So why are you still stuck? Because there's a hidden imbalance in how you learn, and it's killing your progress. Let's look at how most people study English today. They watch videos. They listen to podcasts. They read articles. They scroll through subtitles. They absorb content every day. It feels productive. It feels like progress. And in some ways, it is. This is called input. And input is important. You need it to understand the language. You need it to build familiarity. You need it to recognize patterns. But here's the problem. You're only doing half the job. Because input alone does not create fluency. Fluency comes from output, from speaking, from writing, from actually using the language. And most learners avoid this part. Not intentionally, but consistently. Think about your daily routine. How much time do you spend consuming English? Now compare that to how much time you actually produce English. Speak it. Say it out loud. Use it in real situations. For most people, the ratio looks like this: 90% input, 10% output, sometimes even worse. And that imbalance creates a dangerous illusion. You feel like you're improving because your understanding is growing. You can follow conversations better. You recognize more words. You don't feel lost anymore. But when it's your turn to speak, you realize something is missing because understanding is passive. Speaking is active, and your brain treats them differently. When you consume input, your brain doesn't need to build anything. It just receives. But when you produce output, your brain has to find the words, organize the sentence, control pronunciation, react in real time. That's a completely different skill. And like any skill, it needs practice. You can't think your way into speaking. You have to train your way into it. Let's use a simple analogy. Imagine watching 1,000 hours of basketball. You study the players. You understand the rules. You know the strategies. But you never step onto the court. Will you become a good player? Of course not. Because watching is not playing. And listening is not speaking. Yet, this is exactly how most people learn English. They become excellent observers, but poor performers. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. You don't need more input. You need more output. Because output does something input cannot. It exposes your gaps. When you try to speak, you immediately see what you don't know, where you hesitate, where you get stuck. And that discomfort, that's where real learning happens. Output forces your brain to adapt, to search faster, to connect patterns, to build automatic responses. That's how fluency is created. not by consuming more, but by using more. This is why some people improve rapidly in just a few months, not because they are smarter, but because they speak more. They practice under pressure. They allow themselves to struggle, and through that struggle, they grow. So, if you feel like you've been learning forever, but still can't speak, it's not because you lack knowledge. It's because you lack usage. You've been preparing for the game, but never actually playing it. And there's a reason for that. It's not laziness. It's not lack of discipline. It's something deeper, something emotional. Because the moment you start speaking, something uncomfortable appears, fear. And that's exactly what we're going to face next. Chapter 5. Fear is the real reason you stay silent. Let's be honest. You already know what you should do. Speak more. Practice more. Use the language. You've heard it before. And after the last chapter, it's clear. The problem isn't knowledge. It's action. So why aren't you doing it? Why don't you speak more? Why don't you use English every day? Why do you stay quiet, even when you have the chance? The answer is not logical. It's emotional. You're afraid. Not afraid of English. Afraid of what happens when you use it. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of sounding stupid. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of not being good enough. And that fear is powerful. Stronger than motivation. Stronger than discipline. Because it protects your identity. Think about it. When you don't speak, you can still believe. I know English. I just don't use it. But the moment you speak, that belief is tested. Now it's real. Now people can hear you. Now, mistakes are visible. And that feels risky. So, your brain does something clever. It keeps you safe. It tells you, wait until you're ready. Study a bit more first. Improve your grammar. Learn more words. And it sounds reasonable, even responsible. But because ready never comes. There is always more to learn, always more to fix, always a reason to delay. So you stay in preparation mode, not because you want to, but because it feels safer than exposure. This is why some people who know less English speak more than you. They're not braver. They're just less afraid of being imperfect. They don't see mistakes as failure. They see them as part of the process. So, they speak. They struggle. They laugh. They continue. And slowly, they improve. Meanwhile, you wait. You prepare. You think. You stay silent. And the gap grows. Not because of ability, but because of action. Here's the truth you need to hear. Confidence does not come before speaking. Confidence comes from speaking. You don't wait until you feel ready. You become ready by doing it anyway. Every time you speak, something changes. Your brain adapts. Your reactions get faster. Your fear gets weaker. Not instantly, but gradually. But if you never start, nothing changes. And fear wins. Now, let's go deeper. Why does this fear feel so strong? Because language is not just a skill, it's identity. When you speak your native language, you are fully yourself. You're expressive. You're natural. You're confident. But in English, you feel like a different person. Simpler, slower, less interesting. And that gap is uncomfortable. So, you avoid situations where that version of you is exposed. You protect your identity, even if it means staying silent. But here's what you need to understand. That weaker version of you is not the real you. It's just the early stage of learning. Everyone goes through it. Every fluent speaker you admire sounded broken at the beginning, made mistakes, felt embarrassed, and kept going anyway. So the question is not, are you good enough to speak? The real question is, are you willing to be bad long enough to become good? Because that's the price. Not talent, not intelligence, but tolerance for discomfort. And until you accept that, you will keep learning, but never speaking. Now, even if you overcome fear, there's another problem waiting for you. A silent one, a structural one that makes progress almost impossible. even if you try your best. Let's talk about your environment. Chapter 6. Your environment is designed for failure. Let's say you do everything right. You accept mistakes. You push through fear. You start speaking more. You try to apply everything you've learned. And yet, progress still feels slow, inconsistent, frustrating. Why? Because there's a problem you can't fix with effort. Your environment. Most people are trying to learn English in a place where English doesn't exist. You live your entire life in your native language. You think in it. You work in it. You socialize in it. You consume content in it. And English? English is something you visit for 1 hour a day, maybe less. Then you leave and go back to your normal life. That's not immersion. That's interruption. And your brain knows the difference. Language is not learned in isolation. It's learned through constant exposure, repetition, and necessity. You don't just learn words. You live them. That's why children learn languages so quickly. Not because they're smarter, but because they're surrounded. They don't have a choice. They hear the language all day. They use it to get what they want. They fail, adjust, repeat, and over time, it becomes natural. Now compare that to your situation. You learn English, but you don't need it. You can survive perfectly without it. So your brain treats it as optional, low priority, something to study, not something to depend on. And when something is optional, your brain doesn't fight to keep it. It forgets. That's why you can learn something today and forget it next week. Not because you're bad at learning, but because your environment doesn't reinforce it. Let's go deeper. Even when you try to practice, what happens? You speak to yourself. You repeat sentences. Maybe you record your voice. But there's no real interaction, no unpredictability, no pressure to respond, no feedback. And without those elements, your growth slows down. Because real communication is dynamic. It's messy. It forces you to adapt. And if your environment doesn't give you that, you stay in a controlled, comfortable bubble where nothing challenges you and nothing sticks. This is why people who move to English-speaking countries improve so fast. Not because they study more, but because they're forced to use the language every day. They order food. They ask for directions. They have conversations. They make mistakes constantly, but they can't escape. And that pressure accelerates learning. Now, here's the important part. You don't need to move to another country, but you do need to change your environment. Because if your environment stays the same, your results will stay the same. You can't expect fluency from a system that doesn't support it. So, what can you do? You create an artificial environment. You bring English into your daily life. You increase exposure. You increase usage. You increase necessity. You surround yourself with the language. Even if you're physically alone, you speak with people online. You join communities. You create routines where English is required, not optional. Because once your brain feels that English is part of your survival, everything changes. It pays attention. It adapts faster. It remembers more. But here's the catch. Even in a perfect environment, even with enough practice, many people still don't improve the way they expect. Why? Because they're still approaching English the wrong way, not as a tool, but as a subject. And that mindset changes everything. In the next chapter, we're going to break that illusion and show you why learning English like a student is exactly what's holding you back from using it like a speaker. Chapter 7. You're still thinking like a student, not a user. At this point, you've fixed a lot. You understand that vocabulary alone isn't enough. You've stopped overthinking grammar. You're speaking more. You're trying to build a better environment. So why does something still feel off? Why does progress still feel slower than it should? Because there's one final layer holding you back. Your mindset. More specifically, you're still thinking like a student, not like a user. And that changes everything. Let's go back to how you were taught. In school, English was a subject, something you studied, Something you were tested on. You learned lessons. You completed exercises. You got scores. Success meant correct answers, perfect sentences, high grades. And failure meant mistakes, errors, being wrong. So naturally, you built a habit. Before you say anything, you try to be correct. Before you speak, you try to be sure. Before you act, you try to be perfect. That's how a good student behaves. But that's not how a language user behaves. Because language is not a subject. It's a tool, and tools are meant to be used, not studied forever. Think about your native language again. You don't study it before using it. You don't check if your sentence is perfect. You don't wait until you're sure. You just speak. Because your goal is not correctness. Your goal is communication. That's the difference. Students focus on being right. Users focus on being understood. And right now, you're stuck in the student mindset. Even when you speak, you're still trying to perform. You're trying to prove something, to sound good, to avoid mistakes, to meet an invisible standard. And that pressure changes how you speak. You slow down. You filter yourself. You hesitate. You lose natural flow. But real communication doesn't work like that. In real life, people interrupt each other. They pause. They restart. They use simple words. They repeat themselves. They even make mistakes. And nobody cares. Because communication is messy, but effective. Fluent speakers understand this. They don't try to impress. They try to express. They don't wait for perfect sentences. They say what they can with what they have. And that's why they improve faster. Because they're using the language constantly, not preparing to use it. Let's make this very clear. If you keep thinking like a student, you will always feel like you're not ready. Because there is always more to learn. But if you start thinking like a user, you start acting immediately. You use what you know. You adapt on the go. You improve through experience, not preparation. Here's a simple shift. Instead of asking, "Is this sentence correct?" ask, "Can the other person understand me?" That one change will free you, because communication doesn't require perfection. It requires clarity, and clarity is much easier to achieve. Now, does this mean you ignore improvement? No, but you separate the phases. When you're speaking, you focus on flow. When you're reviewing, you focus on accuracy. Not both at the same time. That's how real users operate. And once you adopt that mindset, everything becomes lighter, faster, more natural. But now, we've reached the final piece. You understand the problems. You see the patterns. You've identified what's been holding you back. So the real question is, what do you do now? How do you actually fix it? Not in theory, not in motivation, but in real, daily action. In the final chapter, we're going to bring everything together and show you exactly how to turn all of this into a system that works. Chapter 8. The Real Solution. How to finally start speaking English. You've made it this far, and now, everything should feel different. Because you finally see the truth. You were not lacking vocabulary. You were not failing grammar. You were not lazy. You were not bad at English. You were simply following a system that was never designed to make you speak. Let's make this simple. If your goal is to speak English, then your method must train speaking. Not indirectly, not someday, but from day one. Here are the principles that actually work. First, speak early. Speak often. Stop waiting. There is no ready. Start with what you have, even if it's broken, even if it's simple, even if it's uncomfortable, because fluency is built through repetition, not preparation. You don't learn to speak by thinking. You learn to speak by speaking. Second, use phrases, not isolated words. Your brain doesn't communicate in single words. It uses chunks. I don't know. What do you mean? Let me think. These are ready-made pieces, and they reduce thinking time. So instead of memorizing vocabulary lists, collect useful phrases. Practice them, repeat them, use them until they become automatic. That's how natural speech is formed. Third, think in English. Translation is your hidden enemy. Every time you translate, you slow down, you create delay, you lose flow. So, start small. Name things around you. Describe what you're doing. Build simple thoughts directly in English. At first, it feels strange, but over time, your brain adapts. And when that happens, speaking becomes faster, smoother, easier. Fourth, train with real situations. Don't just study English. Simulate life. Order food. Introduce yourself. Explain your opinion. Tell a story. Ask questions. Because language exists in context. The more realistic your practice, the more useful your English becomes. Fifth, make mistakes on purpose. Yes, on purpose, because mistakes are not signs of failure. They are signals of growth. Every mistake shows you a gap, and every gap is an opportunity to improve. If you avoid mistakes, you avoid progress. So, instead of hiding from them, use them, learn from them, move forward. Now, let's bring this into reality. What does this look like in your daily life? It doesn't require 10 hours a day. It requires consistency, 20 to 30 minutes of real speaking practice, every day, not passive, not silent, but active. You speak, you record yourself, you talk to someone, you respond out loud, you push your limits, and over time, something incredible happens. You stop freezing, you stop translating, you stop overthinking, you start responding, naturally, automatically, confidently, not perfect, but real. And that's fluency, not flawless speech. Now here's the final truth. You don't need more time. You don't need more intelligence. You don't need more resources. You need a decision to stop preparing and start using, because everything you need, you already have. You just haven't been using it the right way. So, the next time you think, I need to learn more before I speak, stop and ask yourself, or do I just need to start speaking now? Because that moment, that decision, that action is where everything finally changes.